So we all know the importance of telling stories, whether you're talking to people, leading people, or preaching, though many of us may not feel qualified or good enough to tell really good stories. So today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 10 tips for telling better stories.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Drosian. Joining me is Dylan Dodson, and today we are hopefully going to be 15 minutes or less, but we're talking about 10 tips for telling better stories.
So we've talked about before the importance of humor and storytelling and preaching and really any type of communicating to teams, to leaders, or whatever. So I just want to give you some tips on how you can tell stories better, because it is not true that you can't tell stories. You can get better no matter what your gifting is if you're willing to work at it. So here's some things that we've learned, some things that I've learned in telling stories, because I try to do this often because it's important. So here's number one. Personal stories are always best. So stories about you or that have happened to you are always the best, and there's nothing even close. Stories that you've experienced, that you've gone through, there's just something about it when it's not you, even if it's like the exact same story that someone else went through and you tell it, like it's not the same.
Yeah.
People want to know you, they want to connect with you, they want to connect with you. And so when you tell stories about yourself, it's like, oh, that's a normal person. That's funny. That's a struggle that I have. I would just say that there is nothing like telling personal stories. And so you should make sure you're not just telling stories in your sermons, but personal stories.
Yeah, and it can be tough because I've had times where I've heard stories that other people experience that are great or funny or fit in real well, but at the end of the day, it's just it doesn't work.
Right.
It doesn't really work just to try and fit someone else's story in there. No matter how well it really fits with what's going on, it really needs to be your own.
Which leads us to number two, that the more removed you are from the story, the less effective it is. I'm sure there's some psychological survey or study that can be done to show why. I don't know why this is, but even when I just say, hey, the person on staff or my friend, which is better than my friend's friend or someone I didn't know, I could say I did something, or I'm not going to lie, but like if it's something I experienced or something my friend experienced, just by saying it wasn't me, it just does not land. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it just does not land. New City's over 2 years old now, and I try to tell stories a lot. I'm like, it's not even close. It's not that it's bad, but it's just substantially different. And so the more removed you are, it's just like people just don't connect. Saying it's your friend is better than saying it's your friend, or you heard from somebody. Like I would say, I heard this from somebody. It's just, and it's a story. They don't land very well.
Yeah, and I'll also say a lot of times self-deprecating stories are good. I mean, even if it's a funny thing, if it's something maybe dumb that you did in your past that really relates, that works. But when you're talking about something, in the example, something kind of dumb that somebody else did in their past, it goes from being, funny and relatable to kind of sounds almost judgment.
Right.
It sounds weird that you're talking about someone else.
I would even say, even if it was set up well and people know, like, you're not judging someone, it's just even if it was well, it's still not as funny.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, that's great.
Like, we all know someone who did something dumb, but it's us that did it.
Right,
That's
exactly.
different.
And so again, the more removed you are from the story, the less effective it is. Which leads us to point number 3, that stories are the second best.
I didn't get it either at first.
Here's what I mean. Personal stories are by far the best. I would say you've got to have at least one, if not multiple, every single time you preach.
For sure.
Stories are obvious stories that have nothing to do with you. So for Easter that passed recently, I shared a story about a guy who was a bagpiper who played at a funeral and he was late for it. Turns out he was playing at a septic tank thing, and it was, it's a funny story, but it was very obvious that it was a story.
Retelling a story.
Yeah, like a story, whether it's true or false, but like it's just very obvious that this is not me or somebody I know. Again, for whatever reason, personal stories are the best. That makes sense. A story is even more far removed than something that your friend or your friend's friend went through.
Yeah. But
I've just found that obvious stories are the second best. Now, I would say with a caveat that you can really only get away with about one of these a sermon, if not even every sermon.
If not none.
Because if you do it too much, it becomes very like, does he not have any stories about himself? Or like, why is he? It can sound like programmatic almost. I've experienced that when people tell a lot of stories a lot. And I hope that just helps at all. Personal stories are the most important. The more removed you are is not good. But stories are the second best, because I think it's just kind of obvious that you weren't there.
Yeah, I would say look for stories, look for illustrations of stories in your own life that really fit in well, personal stories.
Always number one.
However, when it comes to like stories, maybe if you have one that you're like, oh, this fits in well with this, then goes in. But it's not necessarily something to seek out for each for the message.
Exactly. Now, stories can be extremely powerful, especially if you know of one. But again, if you're trying to fit it in every message or multiple, I wouldn't do that. Number 4, don't be the hero of the story.
That's a good one.
You can never be, like, if you're talking about trying to illustrate a point about trusting God, it cannot be a story about how you trusted God. It just can't. Even if you're not trying to come across as having it all together or be like, people don't want to hear it. People don't want to hear it. This is one of the times where it is actually more effective to share the story of your friend. Now, again, it's somebody you friend or you know, not someone you've heard of. Those aren't helpful. But like a story of someone that you know trusting God. That is really powerful. That is always better than being the hero. Now, there are times where, because personal stories are the best, and let's say you're trying to think of an example. Let's say the whole message is about trusting God. And because personal stories are the best, I wouldn't go an entire message about not sharing a personal story. And so let's say you just have to share a story about you doing the right thing or the good thing. I would always caveat by saying, listen, I don't have this all perfect. I don't have it all figured out. This is one of the few times you want to do some self-deprecating humor that I got it right or whatever. If you happen to be the hero of the story, which has to happen sometimes, I would just say, be very clear that this is the exception to the rule so that people know you're not trying to talk about yourself.
Yeah, and make sure it is the exception to the rule. In other words, make sure that you're not doing it all the time, because people automatically, especially if they're newer, they don't always trust the pastor. I mean, they're not trusting you if all you're coming across is, I've got it all together. My family went through this, and man, look, we trusted God the whole time, and look how great it turned out for us, and things like that. It doesn't help people relate to you. It really turns them against you almost.
Right. It's this quote that people resonate with your strength, or that people admire your strengths but resonate with your weaknesses. If you're always talking about how great you are, people are like, oh, you're awesome, but I have nothing in common with you.
Yeah, that's not me.
And so again, and even if you're not doing this on purpose, you've got to make sure, does this story sound like other? There are so many stories where I'm trying to think of illustrations for a sermon. I'm like, that's good, but I can't share it because it makes me look like I'm awesome, even if I'm not trying to be. So don't be the hero of your story. That's the quickest way to turn people off. Number 5, keep it short. Anything longer than 2 or 3 minutes, unless it's a really engaging story. Even 3 minutes can be too long. You want to cut out as many details and non-relevant information as possible and get to the point, so that people are engaged. People don't just want to sit and hear a rambling story, so keep it short.
Right.
So that's number 5, keep it short. Number 6, use stories after main points. So you may be thinking, when is a good time to use stories? Well, I would say there's pretty much always a good time, because in my experience, most preachers could use more stories, not less. I mean, you don't just want to tell a story the whole time, obviously, but I think people could be more engaging than they are. Yeah, even me. Sure. Even me. But one of the best times to do it is after you make a point. So you make one of your main points, or you have an outline or whatever, something that goes on the screens, something you want people to know, and then illustrating it with a point. This is what Jesus often did with his parables, with his stories. That's how people remember it. It's not just like, oh, that was a good point. Let me give you some statistics onto why that's a good point. Yeah. But actually sharing a story that backs the point up. Here's the thing about storytelling is that, and there's surveys and things that actually prove this, that even if someone disagrees with you or doesn't like you, if you tell a story, they're much more likely to agree with you, even if they don't agree with what you're saying. Right. Because it humanizes it, it makes it real. It's a lot harder to debate the fact that you're emotionally drawn in than if you're just intellectually drawn in, if that makes any sense. But using stories after main points is often the best time. Yep.
Stories will kind of recapture their attention, draw people back in. So if you have people that have sort of drifted off, if it's later in the message, a story can draw them back in and really highlight the point that you're emphasizing. And without that story, they may have just kind of drifted right past it, not even noticed.
Right. So use stories after main points. That's a great place to put them. Number 7 is tell them every week.
Yeah, 100%.
Couple of reasons why. One, if you tell them more, you'll get better at it.
True.
But 2, it's just that's how you engage people, is by telling stories. Again, I've shared this before. The most frustrating thing, and it's not even close about message prep, is not studying the passage. That's actually quite fun, or putting the outline together. It's going through and be like, do I have any stories or illustrations that make this not boring? My philosophy is that you should assume that people do not care what you have to say. If you go in with that, then you'll work harder on trying to draw them in and engage them with what the gospel is trying to say in their life. And so by telling them every week, it is extremely frustrating. It is very frustrating. It is very hard because it's like, I don't even know what to say. Yeah. But that time that you spend trying to think and work through your stories is so important. And so I would say tell them every week.
Yeah. I mean, if you go at it with the mindset of a story will help them relate, it'll help them re-engage, it'll help them really engage with what you're saying, which is the gospel, then you have to tell it every week. Right. I mean, you have to tell it every week, and you have to put in the time to do it. It's not like the secondary thing I prep a message, and then if I can think of something, I'll throw it in there, but I don't really know, and so maybe I'll just forget about it. But if that's what helps emphasize and helps people remember, then that's just as important as any other part of the message prep.
And again, if you're like, well, I can't tell stories, well, it's probably because you're not even trying.
Yeah.
So tell them every week. It'll make you better, and it'll make your messages more applicable. Number 8, practice them out loud. Mm-hmm. So I often hear people say, they'll practice, they'll work through the messages, and then on their notes, they'll just say, I'll tell the story here.
Yeah.
And then they'll wait until they're actually on stage to tell the story, which is the worst time to do it, because you've got to be able to remember the details. You got to be able to cut all the fluff that is irrelevant to what's going on, and you can't do that if you don't go through it out loud. So practice your story out loud so that you know how it'll come across. That way, when you're actually telling it, you're not trying to worry or trying to remember how everything went. You can tell it with a lot more ease.
Yeah, I feel like we've all been in scenarios where we've heard people tell a story off the cuff. Right. And you always tell it's coming when you hear like, oh, that reminds me of, and then they just kind of go off. And it's like, whenever you hear something like, oh, that reminds me of this, and you get this in your mind, like, this isn't going to be a story I want to hear. This is just, it's going to drone on. And it does. So, I mean, if you, like we said, if it's as important as we're saying it is, if you prep everything else and rehearse everything else, that should go right along with it.
So practice practice your stories out loud. Yeah. And even if you're someone that doesn't like to practice your sermons out loud, which I would say you should do anyway.
Do it.
I would practice this even over everything else, because the stories are the one time that everybody's listening. Mm-hmm. And it's the one time to draw people in for good if you can tell better and more clear stories.
And I feel like it's going to be the easiest time to either cut it way too short or to just ramble.
Right.
If you have something come to mind and you're just telling a story, it's going to be so easy just to go on and on about it.
Yeah, exactly. So practice them out loud. Mm-hmm. Number 9, this might be the most important thing to learn, other than maybe all of these, other than like personal stories are best and you should tell them often, is that never, what's the definition of never, Brian?
The opposite of always.
Okay. Never, ever, ever look at your notes when telling a story. Ever. Like, do not do that, because that is first of all, that's an easy way not to be looking at your notes. And second of all, there's nothing worse than someone telling a story about themselves, and they're looking down the whole time. Like, do you not know what's going on? There is no more. You are never more connected with the audience is when you can look them straight in the eye, when you can move about the stage, when you're relaxed, and that doesn't happen if we're looking down at our notes. And so you have to know your stories. Mm-hmm. Now, I would say the exception to this is if you're telling, it's probably a better word for story.
Know what we mean.
Although even that is better than not, but stories kind of make sense. Like, you're reading it. It wasn't something you've done. But if it's a story about you or a story about a friend or whatever, you need to go over, even if it's a story maybe not about you. So, if somebody told you or a friend or whatever, you got to go over enough. You need to go over it enough so much so that you're comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. And it is worth leaving out a detail or two to connect with the audience than to be looking down while you're sharing a story, even just once. Like, do not do it. Spend time, memorize, internalize the story so that you can just give it and have people connect with you while you're giving it.
Yeah, I totally agree with this one. And this is one that frustrates me, and especially earlier on, because if I'd be preparing a message, I'd go through and come up with a story, and there'd be details, and not just details to where I don't want to forget this little part, but I think of kind of a funny way of saying something. And I think comedy is important. Yep. I think of a funny way of saying something, or kind of a way of segueing into something else that I just would be so afraid to miss. And so I'd want to put it in there so bad. And I think I did at first, but you're right. It just comes across as it's not genuine, as it's not real. And so I hate that this is true, but
and here's the thing.
You're totally right.
If it's so important to you, then you can make a point of remembering it. You can. Mm-hmm. And stories are a great way too to kind of wean off using so many notes. If you want to use less, it's like, okay, here's a story. I'm not going to look. And again, the details that you think are really important, which are important, are not as important with you connecting to the audience. Mm-hmm. And so unless it's a story, memorize it, know it. Do not look down while you're telling the story, because people want to connect with you. And then number 10, it's not really a point, but it's something that we say from time to time because it's true, is that no one cares how much you know until you tell a story. So you could be super smart and making all the great points, but unless you can internalize it to your people in a way that they can understand, and a way that they're actually listening to you as you explain it, because nobody's paying attention the whole time you preach, but most, if not everyone, will pay attention when you start telling a story. And you know this to be true because you do the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was a kid going to church, and I would have this the bulletin that I would kind of doodle on, especially when I was in middle school, wasn't paying attention.
Of course.
I would always wait until after the beginning of the message because our pastor always started with a story. And because I knew, even as someone who didn't really like, not that I didn't care, but I just wasn't going to listen, like, I didn't even doodle because I knew a story was coming somewhere in the first minute he was going to start telling a story.
Yeah.
And even as a kid, I was like, I'm listening to this. And so you'll listen to it again. Nobody cares how much you know until you tell a story.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, we know this is important. We know Jesus used parables. We know he used them to relate to people and to tell, to give lessons in a way that they could relate to. So we know that these things are important. And so there's no reason to brush them off. There's no reason to pretend like they're not, because at the end of the day, we all believe that they are.
Right. Again, studying a text isn't hard for probably most of us. Learning about the context, telling them what they need to know, like the information isn't hard. What's the most difficult is the stories. And in my opinion, that's what separates the really great communicators from the not so great ones. It's not just gifting. It's that they make their sermon real, and they make it real through stories.
Right.
So those are 10 tips for telling better stories. Thanks for being with us today on Practical Church Planting. If you have questions about storytelling, preaching, ministry,
Or anything,
practicalplanting.com/questions. Submit it there. We'll talk about it in a future episode, and we'll see you next time on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.